You ever notice how silence has a way of making people uncomfortable? We live in a world that expects noise, explanations, apologies, constant validation. But then she stopped talking, not out of weakness, not out of defeat, but out of strength, out of clarity. She went quiet, and in that stillness, something shifted. The same voices that once talked over her started to miss her presence. The same people who overlooked her started to search for her energy. Because when a woman goes quiet, it's not the end of her story, it's the beginning of her power. This isn't about silence for silence's sake. This is about what happens when a woman reclaims her peace, and the world finally sees what it took for granted. We often mistake silence for surrender. We see someone go quiet and assume they've given up, that they've run out of words, out of strength, out of options. But the truth is, silence can be the most powerful response a person can offer, especially when it comes from someone who has always been expected to explain themselves, to make others comfortable, to constantly perform emotional labor. When a woman goes quiet, it's not always a sign that she's lost her voice. It can be the moment she realizes she no longer owes anyone an explanation. Silence in this sense isn't passive, it's intentional. It's the result of exhaustion and evolution. There comes a point where words no longer serve the same purpose they used to, where defending yourself begins to feel like draining energy into a void. That's when silence becomes an act of self-preservation, of boundary setting, of reclaiming personal space. When she chooses not to respond to every criticism, not to chase validation, not to engage in constant damage control. She's not backing down, she's leveling up. Controlled silence is powerful because it shifts the dynamic, it removes the emotional fuel. Others thrive on the ones who poked for a reaction, who questioned her worth, who tested her patience. They now find themselves facing stillness, and that stillness speaks louder than any angry word or desperate plea. It sends a clear message: you don't get access to my energy anymore. That's a message they're not ready for, because as long as she was speaking, they felt in control. But silence is unpredictable. It makes them sit with their own behavior. It reflects their actions back at them. And for the first time, they're forced to deal with the consequences of their own noise. There's something incredibly magnetic about someone who isn't trying to prove themselves. When she steps back, people step closer. When she no longer participates in the performance, she becomes the center of attention. Not because she's demanding it, but because they finally notice what her presence meant. That quietness doesn't mean absence. It often means clarity. She sees everything. She hears everything. But she doesn't need to respond to everything. That kind of restraint is rare. It's not coldness, it's control. And in that control lies her power. The ones who took her voice for granted begin to feel the weight of its absence. They start to replay the moments she stayed silent, looking for meaning in what she didn't say. That's the power of choosing silence, not forced silence, not silence rooted in fear, but silence that says, I've spoken enough. Now I observe. Now I choose peace over performance. That shift doesn't make her smaller, it makes her unshakable. It shows that real strength isn't always in confrontation. Sometimes the strongest move is the one where you walk away from the noise and let your silence speak every word they failed to hear when you were still speaking. There comes a moment when a woman looks around and realizes that no matter how much she explains herself, it never really changes how she's perceived. She's been justifying her choices, her emotions, her dreams, her boundaries, hoping that if she says it the right way, people will finally understand. But they don't, and the more she tries, the more it drains her. That's when something shifts inside her. That's when she stops explaining and starts evolving. Explanations are often a form of survival, a way to stay connected, to avoid conflict, to be accepted, but they can quickly become chains. When every decision requires a defense, when every boundary needs to be softened so others aren't uncomfortable, when every dream must be downsized so it fits into someone else's idea of reasonable, a woman loses parts of herself without even noticing. She becomes a version of herself that's digestible, agreeable, less threatening, until one day she stops. When she stops explaining, she doesn't become cold. She becomes clear. She begins to recognize that her worth isn't found in how well she convinces others. It's found in how deeply she honors herself. That shift is subtle at first. She speaks less in rooms where she used to over-explain. She no longer softens her no with 5 layers of justification. She doesn't feel the need to fill silences with reassurances. And as she withdraws from the exhausting habit of constantly managing other people's comfort, she starts to grow. Evolution isn't always loud. Sometimes it happens in quiet moments of self-respect, in the decision not to respond to a message that doesn't deserve a response, in the pause before giving an answer, when she checks in with herself first, in the courage to hold a boundary without guilt. That's when she begins to evolve, not into someone new, but into someone she always was underneath all the explanations. And she starts showing up differently. Her presence feels stronger even though she says less. Her choices are firmer even though she explains them less. People begin to sense the change. Some don't like it. They liked the version of her that was always bending, always accommodating. But others begin to respect her in a way they never did before. Because self-respect is magnetic. It doesn't ask for attention. It draws it naturally. By not explaining, she gives herself permission to grow without permission. She no longer waits for the green light of approval. She understands that growth isn't something you broadcast for applause. It's something you do in the quiet, in the moments when you choose peace over performance, self-trust over self-doubt. When she stopped explaining, she stopped shrinking. She stopped editing herself to be more acceptable. And in doing so, she stepped into a version of herself that no longer needed to be explained, only lived. People rarely recognize value when it's freely and constantly available. It's human nature to overlook what they assume will always be there. They grow accustomed to the presence, the support, the understanding, and they stop seeing the depth behind it. She was always there, listening, giving, adjusting, showing up in ways they didn't even realize they needed. But the more consistent she was, the more invisible she became, until one day she wasn't. When she finally pulled back, when she withdrew her energy, her effort, her emotional presence, that's when they noticed, suddenly, the silence they once ignored became deafening. The things she used to handle effortlessly now felt like gaping holes in their lives. The emotional glue she provided, the sense of stability she brought, the way she anticipated needs before they were spoken, all of it gone. And it wasn't until her absence settled in that they finally started to feel what she was worth. People notice absence more than presence. When someone has been a constant source of light, you only truly understand its warmth when it goes dark. When reflection begins, they start asking themselves why she stopped reaching out, why the energy shifted, why the connection faded. They remember the little things they never thanked her for. The thoughtful check-ins, the quiet encouragement, the way she made space for others while shrinking herself. All of it becomes clear when it's no longer there to take for granted. She didn't leave out of bitterness. She didn't disappear out of spite. She just got tired of giving her best to people who treated it like it was ordinary. She realized that access to her was a privilege, not a right, that her time, her heart, her presence carried weight, and she was done offering it to people who saw it as lightweight. The moment she understood that, her energy became sacred. And once she protected it, everything changed. Now they see her differently. Now they wish they had paid closer attention. Now they understand that what she offered came from a deep place of care, not obligation. But it's too late to treat her the way she should have always been treated, because she's not waiting to be noticed anymore. She's not hoping for recognition or chasing appreciation. She learned that her worth doesn't need confirmation from people who only see value in her after she's gone. She learned that stepping away isn't abandonment, it's self-honor. What they miss now isn't just her presence, it's the peace she brought, the grounding, the steady emotional anchor they didn't even realize they relied on. And they begin to feel the cost of what they dismissed, because that's how life teaches hard lessons. Sometimes you don't recognize the gold until it's no longer in your hands. Sometimes you don't see the light until it's no longer lighting your way. And sometimes you don't value a woman's worth until she's no longer offering it for free. Silence has a way of stripping away illusions. When a woman stops responding, stops defending, stops reacting, it creates a space most people aren't prepared to face. That space reveals truths that words once covered up. In her silence, people are left alone with their own thoughts, their own behaviors, and the reality of how they've treated her. The noise is gone, and without it, there's nowhere to hide. That's the power of quiet. It doesn't just create distance, it creates clarity. It forces reflection. And when she was constantly explaining, laughing things off, brushing away disrespect with grace, it allowed others to avoid accountability. They mistook her kindness for tolerance. They mistook her patience for passivity. They assumed she would always bounce back, always be available, always make things easy. But then she went quiet. And in that stillness, people had to listen to their own echoes. They had to sit with what she used to absorb. The sharp tones, the dismissiveness, the lack of care. Without her voice softening the blow, the truth became impossible to ignore. Quietness has a way of revealing who people really are. When she stopped participating in the constant cycle of justification and emotional cleanup, the imbalance in the relationship became clear. The conversations that once felt full now revealed themselves to be one-sided. The connection she carried began to collapse under the weight of her absence. And she wasn't doing anything dramatic. She simply stopped doing what was never reciprocated. She stopped overextending. She stopped translating her worth into effort. Her silence made others confront the gap between how they treated her and what they expected from her. They realized they never truly listened. They just waited for her to fix everything. They weren't paying attention to her pain. They were leaning on her strength. But once that strength was no longer available to them, they began to notice how much they relied on it. Her quietness became a mirror, and what it reflected wasn't easy to look at. For her, silence wasn't retreat. It was an awakening. It was the moment she realized that she didn't have to perform to be worthy, that she didn't need to explain herself into acceptance, that the right people would never need to be convinced. She stopped trying to manage other people's perception of her. She allowed herself the space to feel, to think, to heal without interruption. And in that space, she began to see clearly who truly cared and who only stayed close when her voice made things convenient. The people who never thought twice about their actions suddenly found themselves uncomfortable, not because she said anything, but because she didn't. That's the irony of silence. It doesn't accuse, it reveals. It exposes what noise kept hidden. It doesn't need a confrontation to make a statement. It simply removes energy from places that never appreciated it. And in doing so, it allows truth to rise to the surface, unfiltered and undeniable. She didn't need to shout to be heard. She didn't need to argue to be right. Her power didn't lie in how loud she could be, but in how deeply she understood her own worth. When she went quiet, it wasn't because she was weak. It was because she had finally found peace in her stillness. She realized that not every situation deserves a response, not every challenge requires a fight, and not every person is worth the effort of being understood. In the quiet, she found her voice. That voice wasn't loud, but it was firm. It didn't need to compete because it came from a place of certainty. She no longer felt the need to explain herself to people committed to misunderstanding her. She didn't chase clarity from those who thrived in confusion. Instead, she pulled inward. She reconnected with her thoughts, her feelings, her values. She started choosing her inner calm over external approval. And as she did, something incredible happened. Her self-respect got louder than her fears. The more time she spent in that quiet space, the more she realized how much noise she used to tolerate. The opinions, the expectations, the pressure to prove herself, none of it belonged to her. She was conditioned to speak just to be seen, to justify just to be accepted. But now she saw the truth. Her presence was enough. She no longer needed to raise her voice to make a point. Her silence spoke volumes. It spoke of resilience, of boundaries, of the quiet power that comes from knowing who you are. In that silence, she started making different choices. She stopped over-explaining when she said no. She stopped apologizing for taking up space. She stopped watering herself down to make others comfortable. And for the first time in a long time, she felt free. Not because her circumstances had changed, but because her mindset had. She didn't need the world to validate her anymore. She validated herself. She affirmed her value in the way she showed up for herself. Every single day, people noticed the shift. Some admired it. Others felt threatened by it. They weren't used to this version of her. The one who no longer sought permission, who didn't flinch at disapproval, who held her ground with grace. They missed the version who bent to keep the peace, who explained every boundary, who softened every truth. But she couldn't go back to that version because that version was born from a lack of self-worth. The woman she was now had outgrown the need to be understood by everyone. Her voice in the silence became her compass. It guided her to healthier spaces, stronger relationships, and deeper purpose. She began to speak more through her actions than her words. Her choices reflected the standards she now held for herself. She no longer raised her voice to demand respect. She carried herself in a way that required it. And that inner voice, the one that had once been drowned out by noise, was now the only one she trusted. She had always been present in conversations, in rooms, in relationships. She was the steady heartbeat in the background, the one who remembered the small things, the one who gave even when she wasn't being given to. Her presence was so consistent, so dependable that people stopped noticing it. They mistook her availability for permanence. They assumed she would always be there, always responding, always holding space. Until one day, she went silent. She didn't announce it. She didn't explain. She just stopped. And suddenly, her absence filled the air like thunder after calm. It wasn't her words they missed at first. It was the feeling, the energy she brought, the calm in her presence, the emotional stability they leaned on without realizing, the sense of being seen and heard, even when they gave her very little in return. When that was gone, they began to notice. Not because she said anything, but because she didn't. The silence was not just quiet, it was loud. Louder than her laughter had ever been, louder than all the things she used to say to keep the peace. They felt her absence in moments they never expected to, in the space between messages that used to come without asking, in the emotional void left after she stopped checking in, stopped offering reassurance, stopped smoothing over the rough edges of other people's behavior. They realized that the comfort they once felt wasn't created by them. It was created by her. She had been the warmth, the balance, the quiet strength, holding everything together. Without her, everything felt colder, shakier, a little more chaotic, and still, she said nothing. That silence wasn't an act of manipulation. It wasn't about punishment. It was about protection. She had poured so much of herself into people and places that only took. She gave chances, understanding, and grace until there was nothing left to give. She didn't leave in anger. She left in self-respect. And that's what made her absence even louder, because people didn't get to say goodbye. They didn't get to explain. They didn't get closure. They were left with silence. And in that silence, the truth rang out. The truth was, they had taken her for granted. They had mistaken her emotional labor for simplicity, her kindness for obligation, her consistency for neediness. But now, stripped of her presence, they were forced to face what they'd lost. And they started to see her not just as someone who had been there, but as someone whose presence had meant more than they ever acknowledged. What echoed loudest wasn't the thing she used to say, it was the thing she no longer needed to. Her silence became a boundary, a declaration, a mirror reflecting back to others everything they missed when they had her. The power of her presence became clear the moment it was no longer available. And in that absence, she finally became visible, not as the background character in someone else's life, but as the whole force she had always been.